Hello, and welcome to our patient education series for today. The title of our talk for today is The Monkey Driving Your Mercedes, or the Neurobiology of Substance Use Disorders. And I chose that because, if you had a $100,000 sports car, you would not give the car keys to a monkey because it would wind up being a hell of an exciting ride to some place that you really didn't want to go, which is probably the best metaphor for addiction that I've found. So my name is Mike Bricker. I'm the head of the STEMS Training Institute. And this patient education lecture is available for use with your program if you so desire. So let's launch ourselves into it. This was originally prepared for the APAL meeting in Eugene back in July of 2025. So the monkey driving your Mercedes. We're going to talk today about the three parts of the brain and how they work, or often how they don't work, in substance use and other mental health disorders. Okay, so what's the big deal? Why is this important? Well, first of all, for a patient, I think it's an insult to your intelligence to tell you to do stuff just because I tell you to do stuff. If I can't give you a pretty good reason for the things that I ask you to do, then you ought to be challenging me. Things aren't true just because I say they are. So today we're going to take a look at some basic brain functions. This is not real high-level brain, neurosurgery stuff. Some real basic understanding to help us understand how substance use disorders and also process addictions truly are a brain disorder, and how we can harness the power of the brain to help us to recover and to get well. This is a video clip from a webinar called Pleasure Unwoven. It's been around for about 15 years now, but it still is one of the best explanations for addiction that I've found. So we have a couple of brief clips here.
And they're used to produce intoxication occurs in animals far older than men. It seems that as long as blood is flowed through humans, none of intoxication, so too we find a problem of addiction. Of all the questions we can ask about addiction, there is one question that stands out. All the other questions about addiction begin with this one, and everything hinges on the answer. The most important question about addiction is simply this: is it really a disease? When I first came to treatment for my own problem with addiction, my counselors told me that addiction was a disease. As a physician, I was skeptical. Addiction's not a disease, it's a choice. Diabetes is a disease. The diabetic didn't choose to get it, but the drug addict did have the choice to start using drugs. Cancer is a disease. It befalls an unfortunate person through no fault of their own. But addicts, they do this to themselves. That made sense to me. But the more I expressed my sympathy for the argument against calling addiction a disease, the more my counselors told me that I was in denial and that I needed to surrender. Well, they were right, I did. But as a doctor, I believe that patients have the right to ask questions. And as a patient, I wasn't satisfied with the answers I was getting. A lot of people told me that addiction was a disease, but very few of them could defend that position. And I had to know. So I decided to find out for myself. And that set me on a personal journey that has taken the last 10 years of my life. Along the way, I've come to realize that this question is far more complex than it looks. And finding the answer takes more than medicine and science. Our path travels through philosophy, law, politics, even history. I began my search just trying to make sense of my own addictive behavior. I quickly discovered that I had stumbled across one of the greatest intellectual puzzles of our time.
So how do we know if a process is really an addiction or not? I know that there's a lot of controversy around the word addiction. We're using substance use disorders. Now it's substance misuse disorders. But I think addiction is a useful word, and here's why. It comes from ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, if you were a slave, or if you could not pay the debt that you owed to to your master, you were spoken to them as an indentured servant. Ad tu and dictare, the word to speak, dictation comes from that. So literally, addiction means I am spoken to servitude to a substance. So the American Society of Addiction Medicine has come up with a real good Twitter version of how to know something about addiction. What are the main characteristics? One of them is obviously an inability to consistently abstain from the drug or the behavior. The second one, there is always impaired control over behavior, particularly impulse control. Now, this is the one, and it's only in the last 15 years that this has been included in the definition of addiction. Craving. There is an increased hunger or thirst for drugs or the pleasurable reward for a process addiction. There's diminished recognition of significant problems with people's behavior, and also there are these dysfunctional emotional responses. This is from the American Society of Addiction Medicine. We talk a lot about the progression of the disease of addiction. And this is one real easy way to understand it, and it helps to understand it in terms of the brain. The early stage, everybody goes through this. We're just using to use. This only involves the smart brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, the gray wrinkly stuff that you think of when you think of a picture of the brain. And this is just experimental or non-problem use. Everybody who goes through some kind of substance problem probably starts here. They use it occasionally. They're not getting into trouble. They can stop when they want to. They can control their behavior, and it really isn't a problem until we begin to discover that our drug, our addiction, is a pretty nifty coping skill. And so when I'm feeling bad, I begin to use my drug or my addiction, my addictive behavior, to feel better. Now I'm using in order to cope. And so as the progression of the disease advances, gradually it becomes my number one coping strategy because it works better than anything else right up until it stops working at all. This usually involves the monkey brain, which is we're going to spend a good deal of time today. And then finally, there's the chronic stage. Now I'm only coping in order to be able to use. You know, I can't tell you over a 40-year career how many times I've had somebody say to me, well, I don't have a problem. I still got a job. The job is the last thing to go, because no job, no money, no dope. Okay. So now the only reason that I'm coping is to support my habit. Now, there was a gentleman back in the 1980s and 90s. His name was Paul McLean. And he was a neurobiologist. He really got off on dissecting brains. He wanted to pull them apart and see how they work. And so what he discovered, now remember, this is the 1980s, this is way before the kind of brain scans that we have now. So he would take a brain and literally cut it up to see what made it work. What he discovered is that there are three main parts to the brain. There's all kinds of different subsections, but three main parts. One of them he called the R complex, or the brain stem. This is the brain stem. It's a big old knot of nerves, sits up on top of your spinal cord, and the job of this part of your brain is to keep you alive, pure and simple. It's responsible for our basic life functions, and it's a lot like the operating system on your cell phone, right? It just does what it does in the background. We don't even pay attention to it until something goes wrong. I have a fever, right? So the next part, he was a doctor, he had to use big words. Paleomammalian is simply the old mammal brain. All animals that have a spinal cord have the R complex. Snakes have it, horses have it, birds have it, we have it. However, only mammals have developed a particular part of the brain that is a survival mechanism, and he calls it the old mammal brain. This is the survival brain. I call it the monkey brain. This is responsible for keeping us alive. It is always scanning the environment like radar, looking for possible pleasure and possible danger. Seek pleasure, avoid pain. It satisfies our basic drives. This is the part of the brain that literally drives our behavior. And then finally, there's the new mammal brain, which is responsible for language and logic and problem solving and all that cool stuff. Now, This is not some kind of Freudian id, ego, superego thing. If you take my brain and you slice it right down the center, it's called a sagittal section. You turn it on its side, you can see these three parts of the brain with the naked eye. So the concept of the triune brain is both structure and function. These three clearly distinct reasons have evolved independently over time. Or if you're a literal Bible believer, this is the way God made us on the sixth day. There's no conflict here. But what it means is that they have different jobs, and importantly, they communicate with each other in different ways. Okay, this is the reptile brain, the brain stem. You can see how it sits up on top of your spinal cord. It sits right in here. The next part is the monkey brain. Sits up on top of the survival brain, and all mammals have this part of the brain. And then finally, there's the cerebral cortex, the smart part of the brain that we think about when we think of a picture of the brain. Now, these three parts of the brain, ideally, they're supposed to cooperate smoothly in order to assure our survival and to pursue satisfaction and to make sure that the needs, particularly connection needs, are met. So when we're looking at the cortex, which is the smart part of the brain, it has some different regions. One of them is the frontal lobes, right up here behind your forehead. It's called the prefrontal cortex. This part of the brain is responsible for judgment, impulse control, and memory, storing memory. It's also the seat of what we call social learning. For instance, this is the part of the brain that tells you that you don't go outside without your clothes on, right? Nobody really had to sit you down and beat that into you. You just kind of figured it out. 2-year-olds just love this. They'll go whip the diaper off and go running down the street, and mom and dad are running after them. By the time that they get to preschool, they won't do that anymore because they've learned that it's just not done. Next, the temporal lobe is over here on the sides, responsible for speech and hearing. It's also kind of a volume control on our emotions. This is the part of the brain that tells you that making a pass at your boss's wife at the Christmas party is a bad career move. Then we have the parietal lobes back here. They're responsible for body sensation, movement, and taste. And particularly, there's this little area right here. It's called the sensory motor strip. That's responsible for some fine coordination kinds of things. Then we have the occipital lobes back here, responsible for visual and spatial processing, and finally the cerebellum. We used to think it was mainly involved with balance and coordination, but we now know that it's also responsible for some really complex memory functions that have to do with things like PTSD. So, looking at the inside of the brain, now this is that sagittal section that I told you about. One way to look at this is that the limbic system, the monkey brain in here, this is the brain stem, this is the monkey brain. The limbic system is the medical term. It's like the gas pedal on your car. Okay, this is the part of your brain that motivates your behavior. It has some very basic ideas of what's most important for you, and it's going to go get them. Okay, the prefrontal cortex is a lot like the brakes, the brake pedal. So sometimes the monkey brain says, go, and the prefrontal cortex says, no, I don't think I'm going to light up a crack pipe in study hall. I'll wait until after school. So when these things are coordinating smoothly, life tends to go pretty well. However, over time, the limbic system begins to get more and more powerful. And over time, it will literally hijack that prefrontal cortex. And it's just like a hijacker on an airplane. All of a sudden, there's this threat of not being able to get what I need. So these are the main parts of that limbic system, okay? This is what's called the caudate nucleus. It's a part of the pleasure center of the brain. You probably have heard about dopamine and how important it is in certain functions. This is the part of the brain that really lights up when things get going. So looking at these other little structures, this little thing right here is called the amygdala. It's the Greek word for almond. It's a little teeny tiny piece of brain, no bigger than the thumbnail on my little finger. This is the hippocampus. It's kind of like the file clerk of the brain. And then the thalamus, hypothalamus are involved in some other things that we don't need to go into right this minute. But so what do these different parts of the brain do? Well, the amygdala, that little piece, controls emotions of anger and fear in response to threats, either real threats or imagined. This is where the fight, flight, or freeze response lives that we've heard about. Next, we have the hippocampus. That's the file clerk of the brain. The hippocampus is responsible for encoding incoming information with emotional significance. Basically, it decides what's important and what's not. Let me give you an example. Think back to when you were in 5th grade. Okay, who was the kid who sat one row behind you and one row over? Who was the first one you ever kissed? Bing! Your hippocampus said, "Oh, this is nice. I think I want to remember this." So what it does is it decides which memories are most important to hang on to, and importantly, it hangs on to them there in the limbic system. A lot of them get filed away in the frontal cortex. That's like the filing cabinet for memories. But memories are stored in the cortex, but they're made in the monkey brain. And when the hippocampus malfunctions because of central nervous system depressants, we get a blackout. Then there's the reward pathway or the pleasure center of the brain. So this is Mike's brain. Okay, it's kind of a scary place, but I've learned to live there okay. The 3 parts of the brain, the breathing brain, the monkey brain, and the thinking brain. So the breathing brain, main thing to know is it's responsible for our basic life functions, vital signs like blood pressure, heart rate, body temperature, how fast your lunch is moving through your digestive system. All of those things that we think of as being beyond our conscious control are basically controlled by this part of the brain. Like I said, it's like the operating system on your cell phone. It just does what it does in the background, and we don't even pay attention to it unless something goes wrong. It's responsible for instinctive responses, the trauma response when fight, flight response gets triggered, and some other things. For instance, you cannot sneeze with your eyes open. I don't know why. I don't know what kind of evolutionary advantage that has, but it's true. Now, this is the main pipeline between the brain and the body. Emotions are significant information that we store in the brain. Feelings are literal energy that we hold in the body. This is the part of the brain that becomes physiologically dependent on all drugs of abuse, and is where the symptoms of withdrawal happen. If you think about the symptoms of withdrawal for any kind of drug, the shits, the shakes, the stutters, the sweats, the nausea, the vomiting, all of those things are controlled by that part of the brain. Then we have my friend the monkey brain. This is the home of the dopaminergic reward pathway or the pleasure center of the brain. Okay. This is the part of the brain that becomes addicted. It becomes physiologically dependent and emotionally dependent on the effects of the drug. It's responsible for our emotions. Now, feelings are literal energy that exists in the body. Emotions are the mental interpretation that we give for that information. But it's important to remember that it always starts here. This is responsible for our drives, for motivation and learning. Importantly, the limbic system, the monkey brain, has no sense of linear time. We've done brain scans that show that the attention span of the monkey brain is about 12 to 15 seconds. That's its job, is to get me through the next 30 seconds or so alive, and if possible, feeling better than I feel right now. That's what it does. It's really, really important, but it's really, really basic. So it doesn't understand linear time. Now, if you can't understand linear time, you can't possibly understand cause and effect. So the monkey brain doesn't get drunk today, jail tomorrow. You know, and it's this fact is really, really important. This fact explains some of the things that we do that really convinced us finally, and other people around us, that we were really crazy. We do stuff that makes no sense. I just got my children back from child welfare. I'm so happy to have them home again. My social worker is coming over this afternoon to see if I have milk and formula in the refrigerator, so I think I'll smoke some crack. There's a complete disconnect. The other thing is, and this is also really important, the monkey brain only thinks in images. It doesn't understand language. So all of the good reasons that we store up here in the smart brain for not getting loaded and staying in recovery and doing the things that we're taught in our treatment programs that we need to do, the monkey brain doesn't even hear that. It's like background noise, okay? So the other thing is that this is truly the most powerful part of the brain, literally the part of the brain that drives our behavior. So up to the smart brain, clearly the most intelligent part of the three-part brain, but it is not the most powerful. We really like to think that the cortex is in control, and much of the time it is, until it gets hijacked by the monkey brain. So the thinking brain, what does it do? Logical, linear thinking. Its job is figuring stuff out, planning and execution of identified goals. That's what this part of the brain does. It does live in linear time. It understands past, present, and future. So now it understands cause and effect. The problem is a lot of times the monkey brain isn't listening. So it's responsible for planning and executing identified goals. Most of the time, we think that those goals are identified by the smart brain. I want to graduate from high school. I want to get a good job. I want to go to college. I want to start a family. The monkey brain literally holds a dope pipe up to the smart brain and says, "You're not going to do that. We're going to do something else instead. We're going to figure out how to get loaded and not get caught." So this is where memory is imprinted and learned information is stored, and it thinks in words as well as imagery. So this is the important thing to understand about the monkey brain. When the limbic system senses the need to satisfy some basic life drive, it strives to eliminate that feeling of lack and restore homeostasis or balance. It wants to feel good again, no matter what the cost. It can't evaluate the cost. Oops, sorry, skipped the one. So this is the brain that literally drives our behavior, hence the monkey driving a Mercedes. So when we're looking at the addiction cycle, there is a very predictable way that this tends to occur. First of all, there's intoxication. Let's face it, guys, we get loaded because it feels good, right? So what happens is now we have this wash of pleasure. The monkey brain gets basted and gets drowned in all of these feel-good chemicals until withdrawal sets in. Oh no, now we got the terrible feelings the next day. Oh, why did I do this? I promised I wasn't going to do this again. But now I'm starting to think about, okay, so what am I going to do now? I can't go to work feeling this hungover. I can't go, so I guess, well, maybe just a little sip before I go to work will help me get through. So now this is the merry-go-round that we hear talked about in 12-step recovery circles. This is the merry-go-round. And the worse my addiction got, the faster and faster and faster this spun until it threw me right off. So, okay, so what do you mean addiction is a brain disease, right? It's just bad choices. Well, let's see what he says to say about this.
Many arguments against calling addiction a disease, but the best argument I've ever heard is one I call the choice argument. The choice argument says that addiction can't be a disease because drug taking is a behavior and all behaviors are choices. The choice argument goes on to say that even though an addict might tell you he can't stop drinking or using drugs, that he's powerless over drugs and alcohol, really he can stop anytime. That's right, addicts can quit anytime they want. You just have to help them make the right choice. To show how easy it is to get an addict to stop drinking or using drugs, the choice argument suggests this simple experiment. I take a bottle of alcohol, pour out a glass, and put it in front of the alcoholic. And I offer it up to him. Go ahead, Mr. Alcoholic, take a drink. No, really, it's on the house. But when the alcoholic reaches for the glass, I add a small twist. Oh, but Mr. Alcoholic, if you do choose to take that drink, then I'm going to blow your brains out. Most alcoholics will choose not to drink. And that's the choice argument's point. With a strong enough threat, I can get the addict to stop their behavior in a way I just can't for real patients with real diseases. Diabetes, for instance. You can't put a gun to the head of the diabetic and say, okay, better bring that blood sugar down to 100 or I'll blow your brains out. It's not going to work. The choice argument draws a distinction between behaviors and symptoms. In the case of symptoms, those are part of the disease process. Free will plays no part. We don't hold patients responsible for their symptoms because they can't choose not to have them, and that's why punishing and coercing real patients is inappropriate. But drug taking is a behavior. All behaviors are choices. Free will does exist. The addict is responsible for their behaviors because they can quit if they choose to. You just have to motivate them to make the right choice. That's the choice argument. That's the best argument I've ever heard against calling addiction a disease. And I think it's a darn good argument. But it has problems. And in the end, I think the choice argument is wrong because it fails to take into account some exciting new research about the brain. Research that shows that our capacity for choice is far more complicated and fragile than we ever imagined. Is addiction a disease or a choice? The short answer is addiction is a disease of choice. It's a disorder of the very parts of the brain we need to make proper decisions.
So it's important to understand that the limbic system and the urge to alter, the desire to get high, is a fundamental human drive, just like sex, food, companionship, and survival. It's a gift from the Creator to help us recognize things that are life-affirming, things that are good for us. That's why the limbic system reacts very positively toward those things. So these things that are essential to survival, satisfying hunger and thirst, sexual release, nurturing, connection with other people, connection with caregivers, all of these things trigger that limbic system and flood that reward pathway with dopamine and other feel-good chemicals. They feel good. So all drugs of abuse tickle the monkey brain. If it doesn't light up the monkey brain, you can't sell it on the street. Okay? So the monkey brain gets fooled. Over time, it gets fooled into thinking that that feel-good drug is as absolutely essential to life as air. And it feels like the monkey will die if I don't get some. That's why we say, I'm dying for a drink. Okay, so in all of this, where does it start to go wrong?
wrong in the frontal cortex during addiction. It was developed by Dr. Peter Kalavas at the Medical University of South Carolina and Dr. Nora Volkoff, the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. They recognize that dopamine is important in the early stages of addiction. But the final common pathway in addiction is the glutamate neurons projecting back down from the frontal cortex. Kalavas and Volkoff's research is based on an important new tool that has only recently become available to neuroscience, the technology of brain scanners. Brain scans are essentially photographs of the brain in action. Now, what these brain scans say exactly is still controversial, but Kalavas and Volkoff have found abnormal activity in the brain scans of addicts in two important areas of the cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex. These areas are critical for emotional attachment and decision-making. Kalavas and Volkoff believe that the abnormal activity here is the basis of the overwhelming importance the brain gives to drugs and the uncontrollable urge it feels to seek them. In addiction, the normal top-down control of the cortex over the midbrain simply fails. The addict's prior commitment to quit, their memory of what happened the last time they drank or used drugs, the love they feel for their family, the knowledge of the punishment they know awaits them if they relapse, when the cortex fails, these things are invisible to the addict. Kalavas and Volkoff call this brain state hypofrontality. What was once a healthy, functional decision-making frontal cortex is reduced to a shadow of its former self. Overactivity in some areas of the brain, and in other areas, desolation. This is what lies behind the denial, the personality changes, the breathtakingly impaired decision-making in combination with the tragic loss of insight that characterize end-stage addiction. Addiction begins as a disorder of genes of pleasure, but it ends as a disorder of choice. Hypofrontality gives the addicted brain a powerful tool to protect the connection of the drug to survival, and that tool is called craving. Craving is a difficult concept. We all use the word craving. When people say they crave chocolate, what they mean is they really want chocolate a lot. It's important to understand that's not what the addict means when they say they crave. Craving is an intense, emotional, obsessional experience. The addict wants to think about other things. Their brain is constantly bringing them back to the drug. They're up in the middle of the night. They can't sleep. Their pulse is at 120. They're thinking over and over again, just one more time. That's craving. And make no mistake, that is genuine suffering. And I think it's the presence of craving that defeats that choice argument. You remember the choice argument. Addiction is not a disease because the addict can quit anytime he wants. Go ahead, put alcohol in front of the alcoholic. And when he reaches for it, you point a gun at his head, and he will choose not to drink. And that's true. With a gun to his head, the addict can, in that moment, choose not to drink. But even though the addict isn't drinking or using, he's still craving. He doesn't have the choice not to crave. Once that connection of the drug to survival has been carved into the brain, you don't actually have to have drug use anymore for the disease process of addiction to be active. The choice argument fails because it measures addiction by the addict's behavior. In doing so, it misses the most important feature of addiction to the addict, the craving. The other thing the choice argument doesn't quite get is that if you put alcohol in front of an alcoholic and a gun to his head, he doesn't think, oh, I better not drink or I'll get shot in the head. No, what he thinks sounds more like this. I wonder if he'll really shoot me. I wonder if he's even got bullets in that gun. Maybe his finger will slip off the trigger. I wonder if I can get that alcohol into my brain before the bullet comes crashing through my skull. That's craving. And that experience is as miserable as it is involuntary.
So, looking at what happens to the brain when we use particularly central nervous system depressants like alcohol, pain pills, opium, things like that. What happens is that these central nervous system depressants put the brain to sleep, but they put it to sleep in a particular order that's important to understand. The first part that goes to sleep is the prefrontal cortex. Okay, this is the seat of our judgment and particularly the seat of impulse control. Have you ever tried to take the car keys away from a drunk? Good luck with that. The first part of the brain that goes to sleep is the part that realizes that getting behind the wheel when I'm drunk is a bad move. The next part to go is the temporal lobes. Those are the volume knob on our emotions. The third one, and here's an interesting piece of information. This sensory motor strip, we talked about this a little bit before. Did you ever wonder why 0.08 became the legal standard for intoxicated driving? Well, it just so happens that in naive drinkers, people who are not used to drinking, by the time that their blood alcohol level reaches 0.08, this part of the brain that regulates things like their reaction time and their ability to get their foot onto the brake when they see the brake lights in front of them go off begins to be pretty seriously impaired. Okay, now for those of us who are, I mean, for a lot of us, 0.08, we weren't even warmed up yet. But that's where that 0.08 comes from. So that's the next part to go to sleep. Then finally the occipital lobes and then finally the cerebellum and all that. So these structures of the limbic system, now the outside of the brain, the gray wrinkly part, excuse me, is asleep. Now we're into the monkey brain. Now the monkey brain, the amygdala stays awake for a while. So now we've got no control over our emotions, and often anger and sadness and, getting all weepy and, all that kind of stuff. That's because the amygdala is still awake. The hippocampus. Well, when the hippocampus gets numbed out and goes to sleep, we have a blackout, right? Blackout, we all know, has nothing to do with passing out. A blackout, you could be walking and talking and other people might not even realize that you're intoxicated, but you don't remember anything. And by the way, when you have a blackout, what happens 2 or 3 days later, right? All of a sudden you start to get these little flashes of memory that come out. That's because the hippocampus just kind of stored them randomly in the cortex without any frame of reference. But now the pleasure center is in control and the monkey wants more. This is one of the principal reasons for overdoses. Very few people wake up one morning and say, okay, today's the day I'm going to kill myself with dope. It's not how it works. Just one more. Just one more bump. Just one more. And one more is too many. So stimulants work in the opposite direction. Cocaine, meth, things, they work in the opposite direction. They completely overwhelm the frontal cortex with this flash flood of neurochemicals and completely override our conscious control. So as an interesting exercise, if you happen to be doing this in a group room, think about this. 100 people go to residential treatment. 100 people go to treatment. They all complete successfully. They all make it to the next level of care. A year later, how many of those 100 people will still be sober? And when I do this with in my groups, I get answers like 2, 5, 10. Actually, the majority of them probably will be in some level of recovery because we tend to think that addiction and relapse go together like bread and butter. But actually, the relapse rates for other chronic diseases are actually higher. The relapse rate for diabetes is about the same. The relapse rate for hypertension or high blood pressure and asthma are even higher. It's because the addiction is a chronic medical neurological disorder. And people who relapse to hypertension and asthma relapse for exactly the same reason that we relapse to alcohol and drugs. They stop doing what was working. They stop taking their medications. They stop doing the healthy things. They stop hanging around other people with healthy values. And all of a sudden, they're right back in again. So another thing, why do we tell you to stay away from people, places, and things where your drug's being used, right? Well, here's why. The olfactory bulb is hardwired into the limbic system as a survival tool. I mean, we all know dogs can smell fear, right? Dogs have a limbic system. They smell a threat, they react, right? So the olfactory bulb, your sense of smell, is hardwired into the limbic system. So when it gets triggered by the smell or the taste of our drug, suddenly it sets off a really strong survival craving. Now, another thing, why can't you get rid of, why can't you get off of methamphetamine by switching to alcohol? I mean, it seems like it's the exact opposite, right? That ought to work. Well, here's the thing. Different drugs of abuse actually activate first certain little pieces of the brain. It's not important to know what they are, but it's these three pieces right here. Now, it looks like those are three different parts of the brain. But remember, this is a slice down the center. So those three parts of the brain are actually all connected. It's like a pretzel. And so in the brain, those things are no further apart than the knuckles on my little finger. And in terms of brain speed, that's no time at all. So here's the metaphor. It doesn't matter if the burglar comes in the front door, the back door, or the basement window. Once they're in the house, things are going to get interesting. So that's one of the reasons why we talk about cross addiction. You can't switch dysfunctional behaviors and expect to have a non-dysfunctional life. When you think about it, it really doesn't work that way. So 12-step stuff. Brain science doesn't conflict with 12-step approaches to recovery at all, or any other kind of recovery, refuge recovery, smart recovery, women for sobriety, the red road, wellbriety, all of those things are the same because they all work the way that the brain is designed to work. Okay. Using the 12 steps as an example, step one is abstinence. Well, we have to get the brain stem cleaned out first, right? We have to get detoxified and get the brain stem unpickled. Then, when we begin to look at some of the other steps, they really target the limbic system. They really target that monkey brain with the desire to feel some hope, to feel a sense of relief, a sense of empowerment that I really can do something different. Then a lot of the other steps, what we sometimes call the action steps, really target the prefrontal cortex, all right? Good decision making, remembering how bad things were, acknowledging my shortcomings as a human being, beginning to take ownership, taking responsibility. All of those things target the smart brain. And then finally, when we have all three parts of the brain working together and focused on right feeling, right thinking, and right action, this is what we call the spiritual awakening. It's brain science. So, okay, so what does it all mean? Well, here's a little bit of a wrap up. By the way, I asked him one time, why so much music? Why so much music here? He said it was to give the audience time to think.
Klaus and Volkov call this brain state hypofrontality. What was once a healthy, functional decision-making frontal cortex is reduced to a shadow of its former self. Overactivity in some areas of the brain, and other areas, desolation. This is what lies behind the denial, the personality changes, the breathtakingly impaired decision-making in combination with the tragic loss of insight that characterize end-stage addiction. Addiction begins as a disorder of genes and pleasure, but it ends as a disorder of choice. Hypofrontality gives the addicted brain a powerful tool to protect the connection of the drug to survival, and that tool is called craving. Craving is a difficult concept. We all use the word craving. When people say they crave chocolate, what they mean is they really want chocolate a lot. It's important to understand that's not what the addict means when they say they crave. Craving is an intense emotional obsessional experience. The addict wants to think about other things. Their brain is constantly bringing them back to the drug. They're up in the middle of the night. They can't sleep. Their pulse is at 120. They're thinking over and over again, just one more time. Craving. And make no mistake, that is genuine suffering. And I think it's the presence of craving that defeats that choice argument. You remember.
Okay. I think that bears repeating. Craving is really the central symptom of all addictive disorders. Okay, another thing we've all heard. Okay, HALT, right? Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Well, those three relapse triggers all live in the brain. The first three have to do with the limbic system, the monkey brain, and the last one has to do with the brainstem. So we all know that every person has these basic needs for survival and for safety and to belong and to have a sense of worth. These three needs are building blocks within the brain. And so that's one of the reasons why any good recovery program of any kind is going to incorporate these elements. I'm sorry, you can't see my hand when I do that. These elements, because they're all about healing the brain. So when you put it all together, what does this all mean? Okay, here's a little bit about recovery.
This brain state is not permanent. The brain can heal, and recovery is possible. In fact, people get sober all the time. Some go to AA or NA, but there are many different paths to recovery. And what all these people with stable recovery have in common is that they stop doing the things or curtail the things that cause dopamine surges. They learn to cope with craving and drug cues. They become very good at managing stress quickly, usually in a social or spiritual context. And with time, the frontal cortex regains control over behavior. The power of choice is restored. And eventually, the hedonic system comes back online. And normal pleasures, once again, become normally pleasurable. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, the brain's hypofrontality resolves, and the recovering addict's capacity for choice is restored. As long as they manage their addiction on a daily basis, people in recovery can make the choice to stay sober.
This is Dr. Kevin Macauley. He is the author of this. It's called Pleasure Unwoven. It's one long DVD. It was originally put out on a DVD 15 years ago, maybe longer. But it's also available on YouTube, which is where I got these clips from. So, bringing this all home, what's the take-home message? Hopefully, Triune Brain research, this three parts of the brain stuff, will help understand addiction as a brain disorder. It's not weakness, it's not bad choices or moral feelings. Hopefully, it'll help you understand why your counselors tell you the things that they do. It explains cross addiction, why it's difficult to, you can't solve one addiction by starting another one. Doesn't work. When you say it out loud, it's like, huh? Hopefully, it helps to kind of demystify the recovery process and give you some logical explanations and reasoning for the things that you're doing. And it shows that treating all forms of addiction is basically the same. It all has to do with healing the monkey brain. So I want to thank you for your time and attention. I really want to thank you for sharing hope, help, and healing with the other people in your recovery network. And by the way, this presentation was made with natural intelligence. There were no AI chatbots were harmed in making this slideshow. So there is hope. And we are all strongest and most beautiful in the broken places. I want to thank you for your time and attention. And maybe I'll see you at a meeting sometime. Thank you. Goodbye.